Welcome to the Black Anarchist podcast, a channel where critical thinkers come to learn and grow. Through pedagogical discussions, we challenge the status quo, conventional narratives, and present raw truth. Today we're going to uncover the unsettling role that white women played in slavery. Throughout history, slavery in the American South has often been portrayed as a male-dominated institution, with white men seen as the primary enforcers of oppression. However, this perspective ignores a critical truth. White women were not merely passive beneficiaries. They were active participants who wielded immense control over the lives of enslaved people. And they were her property, white women as slave owners in the American South. Historian Stephanie E. Jones Rogers challenges long-held assumptions by exposing the brutal and direct role that white women played in owning, punishing, exploiting, and profiting from slaves. Their involvement extended beyond complicit acceptance. Many white women demonstrated cruelty and business acumen in the trade and control of human lives. Today we're breaking down these disturbing truths and confronting how deeply white women were involved in maintaining and benefiting from slavery. One of the least discussed aspects of American history is that while white women couldn't own land or other forms of property outright, they could own slaves. Why? Because slaves were considered as movable property or chattel. Let's break it down. Many white women inherited slaves from their fathers or husbands, just like they would inherit furniture or livestock. This allowed them to retain wealth and power even when they had few legal rights over land. While marriage laws prevented women from owning traditional property, slaves were considered an exception due to their financial value. A dowry, which was a transfer of money, property, or goods from the bride's family to the groom upon marriage, often included slaves. Many women entered marriage with a dowry of slaves and maintained direct control over them, using them as a source of personal wealth and power. Because slavery was fundamental to the Southern economy, courts often upheld women's rights to own and trade slaves, recognizing their financial stake. White women were not just passive slave owners. They actively used slaves as financial assets, collateral, and investments. They bought, sold, and traded human lives for profit. Slaves were considered the wife's sole property. Even in cases of divorce, white women were allowed to keep their slaves. For much of history, white women have been depicted as passive participants in slavery, detached and lacking authority. However, historian Jones Rogers presents compelling evidence that many white women were not only complicit, but often just as, if not more brutal than their male counterparts. White women personally beat, whipped, and mutilated slaves, using household tools like fireplace pokers, rolling pins, and kitchen utensils to inflict pain. Some forced slaves to strip naked before whipping them, maximizing humiliation. Others used hot irons to burn their skin or scalded them with boiling water as punishment. Some white women forced slaves to kneel on sharp objects for hours, causing excruciating pain and long-term damage. There were also accounts of white women tying slaves to trees or posts and leaving them exposed to the elements for extended periods as a form of punishment and control. White women didn't just own slaves, they controlled their reproduction. Some chose which enslaved men and women should procreate, forcing sexual relationships to increase their stock. Others facilitated rape by white men to ensure more enslaved children were born into bondage. The idea that black men can achieve liberation through sexual access to white women is a myth. Historically, black men have had access, but always in a subservient and exploitative capacity. This historical dynamic still dictates racial and gender power structures today, influencing economic opportunities, legal outcomes, and societal perceptions of black masculinity and white womanhood. From disparities in sentencing laws to media portrayals that reinforce harmful stereotypes, the legacy of these power imbalances continues to manifest in modern systems of oppression. What's often ignored is that Some white women raped their male slaves, further reinforcing their dominance and control. This exploitation was not about desire, but power, reducing black men to objects of subjugation within a racial and gender hierarchy. Though this part of history has been largely ignored, numerous historical accounts and testimonies, such as those documented in the WPA slave narratives, reveal that enslaved men had no ability to resist sexual coercion. White women wielded power over every aspect of their lives, using racial and gender hierarchies to enforce submission. Slave women in particular faced extreme cruelty at the hands of white women. Many were subjected to relentless physical abuse, beatings, and psychological torment. White women often saw them as competition or treated them with spiteful jealousy, particularly if they suspected their husbands of being attracted to black women. Some white women would deliberately starve black women to make them appear less desirable or force them into grueling labor while pregnant, leading to miscarriages or stillbirths. Others took out their rage on black women through violent acts such as disfiguring their faces, cutting their hair, or subjecting them to public humiliation. Slave women were often forced into the most grueling household tasks such as cooking, cleaning, and caring for white children, while being under constant surveillance. They were expected to wake before dawn and work until late at night, often without adequate rest or food. Many were punished severely for any perceived shortcomings, such as failing to meet unrealistic cleanliness standards or reacting with anything other than complete submission. Some were even forced to breastfeed the children of their enslavers, while their own children suffered from neglect and malnutrition. This ceaseless labor, combined with harsh punishments and emotional abuse, left black women with little freedom or respite. As punishment, some white women denied slaves food and medical care, leading to starvation and death, particularly among children. Slave children were often given the least amount of food, sometimes only scraps or nothing at all, leading to severe malnutrition. White women also refused medical treatment for enslaved children, allowing minor illnesses to turn fatal. Physical abuse was common. Children were beaten, whipped, and even forced to work from extremely young ages. Some were made to stand in stressed positions for long periods, while others were locked in closets or basements as punishment. Slave children were seen as expendable, as their suffering was often ignored or even encouraged by white women who saw them only as property to be controlled. "They were her property" forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that white women were not just beneficiaries of slavery, but active participants in its brutality. White women's ability to own, trade, and exploit slaves was made possible by the very patriarchal system that restricted them in some areas while granting them power in others. This dual dynamic allowed them to wield oppression while benefiting from racial supremacy. By benefiting from both racial supremacy and male-dominated legal structures, white women became enforcers of white supremacy, wielding their limited legal agency to oppress black people for their own gain. This legacy did not end with the abolition of slavery. The system of white supremacy could not exist without white women. They were not only complicit, but essential to its structure, actively enforcing racial hierarchies and benefiting from the oppression of black people. The system of white supremacy was created to divide the working class, ensuring that racial divisions kept power in the hands of the elite. Whiteness is not just a race. It is an arbitrary class construct that has evolved over time to maintain economic and social hierarchies. The structures that allow white women to benefit from white supremacy have evolved, embedding themselves in modern systems of privilege, economic disparities, and racial injustice. From discriminatory housing policies to disparities in the criminal justice system, the same power dynamics continue to shape the experiences of black people today. White women, especially those who complain about systemic patriarchy, must grapple with this history and acknowledge how they continue to benefit from racial privilege while simultaneously using feminist critiques to distance themselves from their complicity in white supremacy. Diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives were built to uplift the descendants of slaves and address racial inequalities, but white women have taken the biggest share. They didn't advocate for DEI, yet they have profited the most, securing jobs, promotions, and influence while leaving black people behind. These programs, originally designed to address systemic racism, have instead allowed white women to reinforce their privilege in employment, education, and corporate leadership. Rather than dismantling racial disparities, DEI has been co-opted to benefit those who were never its intended focus. White women today often try to rewrite history, blaming white men for slavery and Jim Crow, while ignoring their own deep involvement. But history doesn't lie. They weren't just bystanders, they were active enforcers of white supremacy, and their legacy still shapes racial inequality today, shifting the blame entirely onto white men. However, the history makes it clear that white women were just as invested in and benefited from these oppressive systems. From their direct ownership of slaves to their active participation in enforcing racial hierarchies through extreme violence and economic exploitation, white women played a crucial role. Their wealth and social standing were built on the backs of black labor, and they used this position to maintain and reinforce white supremacy. Rather than being passive participants, they actively upheld racial hierarchies for their own economic and social gain, whether through direct ownership of slaves, economic gain, or enforcing racial hierarchies. They played an integral role in upholding white supremacy. Recognizing this reality is crucial in dismantling the myths of white female innocence and understanding how systems of control and exploitation continue in modern forms. If we don't face these truths, we risk allowing history to repeat itself under new guises. The key is not about holding individuals accountable, but rather recognizing the truth. White women were not just passive beneficiaries of white supremacy. They were active participants in slavery and Jim Crow. The true remedy for slavery isn't a check, it's sovereignty. Achieving real autonomy and self-determination is the only way to break free from the systems that still hold us back. Achieving real autonomy and self-determination instead of mere financial compensation. Acknowledging history means understanding that the structures of white supremacy persist, and real justice requires dismantling these systems, not just redistributing wealth within them. If we don't face these truths, we risk allowing history to repeat itself under new guises. Thank you for joining the Black Anarchist podcast. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. The struggle is real, and the fight for liberation is far from over. Get sovereign or die trying.